On the morning of August 22nd, 2026, trucks lined up for miles at the Peace Bridge between Fort Erie, Ontario, and Buffalo, New York, drivers watching a deadline arrive that would reshape one of the most integrated manufacturing relationships on the planet. A 50% tariff on billions of dollars of Canadian goods had just taken effect. Steel, aluminum, wine, cement, even hockey sticks. And within 72 hours, the President of the United States would announce something even bigger was coming. By January 1st, 2027, tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, and auto parts would double to 50% as well. Most people watching the headlines saw this as just another round in a trade fight that's been running since early 2025. But that's not the real story. The real story is what happens when a country that built its entire industrial base around selling to one customer suddenly finds that customer closing the door, and what that reveals about how fragile economic integration really is, even between the closest of allies. Because underneath the tariff numbers is a much bigger question. Can Canada's manufacturing base survive being systematically cut out of the market it was built to serve? And if it can't, what does that mean, not just for Canadian workers, but for every country that assumed its trade relationship with Washington was permanent? To understand how we got to trucks stacking up at a bridge crossing in August 2026, you have to go back to a decision made a generation earlier, one that most people outside of trade policy circles never think about. In the early 1990s, the United States, Canada, and Mexico built a free trade architecture. First NAFTA, then its 2020 successor, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, specifically designed to let manufacturing move across the northern and southern borders with almost no friction at all. Auto parts, in particular, were built around this idea. A single vehicle could cross the Canada-U.S. border 6, 7, sometimes 8 times during production, as different components were stamped, welded, wired, and assembled in plants scattered across Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio before a finished car ever reached a dealership. That system created enormous efficiency. It also created enormous dependency. Canada, with a domestic market of roughly 40 million people, built an industrial base sized for a market of over 330 million. Auto plants in Windsor, Oshawa, and Brampton weren't built to serve Canadians. They were built to serve Detroit's supply chains and American consumers. Steel mills in Hamilton and aluminum smelters in Quebec weren't sized for domestic demand either. They were built explicitly to feed American construction, aerospace, and manufacturing. That decision, made decades ago, is exactly why the events of 2025 and 2026 have hit Canada as hard as they have. When your industrial base is built around one customer, that customer holds enormous leverage. And in 2025, that leverage got used. The current trade war formally began on February 1st, 2025, when President Trump announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, a 25% levy on most imports, and a 10% tariff specifically targeting Canadian energy products. Canada didn't sit still. Ottawa retaliated almost immediately with tariffs on $30 billion of American goods, and within 3 weeks expanded that retaliatory list to cover $155 billion in U.S. exports. What followed was more than a year of escalation, negotiation, partial deals, broken deals, and renewed threats. The administration invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, a Cold War-era statute originally designed to protect industries considered vital to national security, to justify tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, trucks, automobiles, timber, lumber, and even pharmaceuticals. For a brief window in early 2026, it looked like some of that pressure might ease. The U.S. Supreme Court struck down several of the administration's broadest emergency tariffs, the ones imposed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, ruling in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump that the executive branch had overstepped its authority. But that ruling didn't touch the Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, and it didn't stop the administration from finding new legal tools to keep the pressure on. That's where Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930 comes in, a statute so old and so rarely used that most trade lawyers had to go back to their textbooks to remember it existed. Section 338 lets a president impose tariffs on a country the administration determines is discriminating against U.S. exports compared to how it treats imports from other trading partners. On July 20th, 2026, the White House used exactly this power, issuing 3 separate proclamations, imposing an additional 50% tariff on certain Canadian goods on top of everything already in place. The White House pointed to specific numbers to justify the move, Canadian tariff rate quotas on U.S. cheese, for instance, which the administration argued were far more restrictive than the quotas Canada extends to cheese imports from the European Union, despite Canada having trade agreements with both. It also cited a steep decline in Canadian purchases of American products. U.S. motor vehicle imports into Canada down roughly 22%, or $5.6 billion, between April 2025 and March 2026 compared to the prior year, and American alcoholic beverage imports into Canada down a staggering 81%, or $582 million, over a similar period. According to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the July proclamations affected close to $20 billion in annual Canadian imports. And crucially, the White House noted something else. Of all the countries facing new American tariffs over the past year and a half, only 2 chose to retaliate rather than negotiate. One was China, the other was Canada. That 50% tariff wasn't a one-time shock. It took effect on August 19, 2026, and it landed just as a fragile set of trade talks between Washington and Ottawa were collapsing. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney had been trying to negotiate a new deal that would specifically address the punishing tariffs on Canadian automobiles. But, according to Carney, American negotiators came to the table asking for concessions that would have inflicted long-term damage on Canada's economy while offering very little in return. They asked too much and offered too little, Carney told reporters at a press conference. He went further, accusing the Trump administration of using economic integration itself as a weapon, turning the very interdependence that decades of free trade had built into a tool of coercion. When the talks broke down, the 50% tariffs that had been paused or threatened went into full effect on roughly $28 billion of Canadian goods, according to Carney's own accounting, and Canada responded exactly the way it said it would, dollar for dollar, matching the American tariffs with counter tariffs of its own. Then, on August 24th, President Trump escalated again. In a post on Truth Social, he announced that starting January 1st, 2027, tariffs on all cars, trucks, both large and small, automotive parts, and steel would rise to 50%. Steel tariffs were already sitting at 50%, which left trade analysts scratching their heads over what exactly the announcement changed for that sector. But the message for the auto industry was unambiguous. Parts that had never faced a tariff before were now going to be taxed, and the vehicle tariffs Canada had spent months trying to negotiate down were instead about to double. Trump's language in that post was blunt. He accused Canada of ripping off the United States of America for years, claimed the country had been hurting American farmers through its own protectionist policies, and declared that Canada will be treated like a state no longer, a reference to his repeated provocative suggestion over the past year that Canada should simply become the 51st American state. They feel entitled, he wrote, and yet we don't need Canada. They need us. They do 95% of their business with the U.S., with us, the exact opposite. That single statistic, that Canada sends roughly 95% of its exports southward, while the U.S. sends only a small fraction of its own trade north, is the entire strategic logic behind why this trade war has been so lopsided in its impact. The United States is a $19-plus trillion economy that can absorb the loss of Canadian trade as a rounding error in aggregate terms, even if specific American industries and consumers feel real pain from higher input costs and retaliatory tariffs. Canada, by contrast, built entire regional economies, especially in Ontario, Quebec, and parts of British Columbia, around uninterrupted access to that same market. That asymmetry is why Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, reacted to the new 50% auto tariffs with a level of anger unusual even by the standards of this trade war. Ford, whose province is home to the overwhelming majority of Canada's auto manufacturing capacity, told reporters that Trump had declared war, economic war, against his closest friend and ally. He went further, invoking Ronald Reagan's well-documented opposition to protectionist tariffs, a reference Ford had previously used in a television ad campaign aimed directly at American consumers, and pointedly noted that Trump keeps a portrait of Reagan near his desk in the Oval Office. Ford's warning was blunt. If the administration keeps trying to dismantle Canadian manufacturing, he said, he better have a pack of batteries, a jab referencing Ontario's growing electric vehicle battery manufacturing sector, and the broader reality that supply chains cut both ways. Trump responded on Truth Social, though the specifics of that exchange matter less than what it reveals. A trade relationship that used to be handled through quiet, technocratic negotiation between USTR officials and Global Affairs Canada is now being conducted, in large part, through public social media posts and press conference broadsides. That itself is a significant shift, and it's part of why markets, workers, and business owners on both sides of the border have struggled to plan more than a few months ahead. Now let's get into what these tariffs actually do to a factory floor, because the mechanics matter enormously here, and this is where a lot of coverage stays too vague to be useful. When the U.S. imposes a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, it doesn't simply mean Canadian steel companies pay a fee to the U.S. government and continue business as usual. It means that Canadian steel, at the border, instantly becomes 50% more expensive than it was the day before in a market where American buyers can often substitute domestic steel or steel from other countries facing lower tariffs instead. According to the Bank of Canada's own Year 1 assessment of the trade restrictions, Canadian steel exports to the United States have fallen by roughly half since the tariffs took hold. Production and employment in the sector have also declined, though not by quite as much as the export numbers alone would suggest. And the reason for that gap matters. The Canadian government responded with its own protective measures. A Buy Canadian procurement policy directing government purchasing toward domestic producers, retaliatory counter-tariffs on American goods, and tighter import quotas designed to prevent a flood of cheap foreign steel from filling the gap left by lost U.S. sales. Those measures have kept some mills running that might otherwise have shut down entirely. But the Bank of Canada's analysis also flagged a serious risk on the horizon. Many steel supply contracts were negotiated years ago and are only now beginning to expire through 2026, which means the full impact of the tariffs on production and jobs may not have fully hit yet. In other words, the worst of the steel story might still be ahead, not behind. Aluminum tells a slightly different but equally revealing story. Canadian aluminum producers, who depend on the U.S. market as their single largest export destination, are now facing that same 50% tariff, with derivative aluminum products facing an additional 25% on top. When the tariffs first hit, Canadian aluminum exports to the U.S. collapsed, down roughly 50% from 2024 levels by the summer of 2025. Producers scrambled to redirect sales to Europe, but at meaningfully lower profit margins, since European buyers weren't offering the same prices American manufacturers historically had. Then something interesting happened. Once U.S. domestic aluminum inventories that had built up in anticipation of the tariffs were finally depleted, American buyers had no choice but to come back to Canadian suppliers, and exports partially rebounded, regaining more than half of what had been initially lost. Industry consultations cited by the Bank of Canada even suggested that disruptions to aluminum production in the Middle East, tied to broader regional instability, were creating additional demand for Canadian aluminum that could help offset losses elsewhere. That's an underreported wrinkle in this story. Global instability in one region can sometimes create an unexpected lifeline for an industry being squeezed by trade policy in another. Employment in aluminum production, according to that same analysis, has remained relatively resilient compared to steel. A reminder that not every tariffed sector is being hit equally hard, and that blanket claims about total industrial collapse don't hold up against sector-by-sector data. The automotive sector is where the story gets the most complicated and arguably the most consequential, because it's the sector with the deepest cross-border integration and the largest number of workers directly exposed. Decades of nearly frictionless Canada-U.S. auto trade created supply chains that are, in the words of one RBC economics analysis, deeply integrated and extremely difficult to adjust on a short time frame. You cannot simply relocate a stamping plant or requalify a supplier network in a matter of months. These are investments measured in years and hundreds of millions of dollars. As of RBC's most recent tracking data, Canadian value-added motor vehicle and parts production was down roughly 3% year-to-date, though it had shown some signs of stabilizing, with a modest 2% year-over-year increase in September, the first such increase since the end of 2023. That's a sector under real strain, but not one in freefall, at least not yet. The bigger threat is what's still coming. With auto and auto parts tariffs set to double to 50% on January 1st, 2027, economists and industry analysts warn that a second wave of disruption is likely, precisely because so many labor contracts and supply agreements in the sector are negotiated on 6 to 12-month cycles. Andrew DeCapua, principal economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, has warned that as those contracts expire and get renegotiated under the new, harsher tariff regime, a further recalibration, economists speak for layoffs and plant slowdowns, is likely still ahead for Canada's auto workforce. Now let's talk about the human cost in hard numbers, because this is where the abstraction of tariff percentages becomes very concrete for actual workers. Statistics Canada. Data shows that manufacturing, the sector most directly targeted by the steel, aluminum, and auto tariffs, shed 51,800 jobs over a recent 12-month stretch, more losses than any other industry in the entire Canadian economy. The overwhelming majority of that pain landed in Ontario, the heart of the country's manufacturing and auto sector. In January 2026 alone, manufacturing lost 28,000 jobs in a single month, a 1.5% drop that helped drive a broader net loss of 25,000 jobs across the entire Canadian economy that month, the first overall monthly employment decline since the previous August. There's a strange statistical twist buried in that data, though, and it's worth explaining because it's exactly the kind of underreported detail that changes how you should read the headline numbers. Despite the job losses, Canada's unemployment rate actually fell to 6.5% that same month, touching a 16-month low. Why? Because 119,000 fewer Canadians were actively searching for work, meaning they'd effectively dropped out of the labor force altogether, whether due to discouragement, retirement, returning to school, or other reasons. Bradley Saunders, a North America economist at Capital Economics, described it as the largest one-month decline in the labor force in 5 years. That's a critical distinction. An unemployment rate can fall even while the underlying job market is weakening if enough people simply stop looking. Economists have been blunt that this kind of headline improvement masks a much deeper structural problem in the labor market. Beyond direct manufacturing job losses, economist Trevor Tom has modeled the broader ripple effects of the 50% steel and aluminum tariffs across the entire Canadian economy, and his findings are sobering. Combining direct losses in targeted sectors with indirect effects rippling through supply chains, Tom estimates that as many as 90,000 Canadian jobs are at risk. The direct losses concentrate in agriculture, electronics manufacturing, textiles, furniture, plastics, and electrical equipment, sectors you might not immediately associate with a steel and aluminum tariff, but which depend on those metals as core industrial inputs. The indirect effects are even broader, rippling into transportation and warehousing, where lower overall trade volumes mean fewer trucks on the road and fewer drivers needed to move goods that are no longer crossing the border in the same volumes. Wholesale trade and professional, scientific, and technical services also absorb losses in this model because when exporters shrink, so does their demand for logistics, consulting, engineering, and other supporting services. This is the kind of second and third order economic damage that rarely makes it into a headline about a tariff announcement, but it's exactly the sort of consequence that determines whether a trade war produces a temporary bruise or a lasting structural wound. It would be inaccurate, though, to describe Canada's manufacturing base as simply collapsing across the board, and here's where the honest strategic assessment has to complicate the dramatic framing. Statistics. Canada's industrial capacity utilization data, essentially a measure of how much Canadian industry is producing relative to its total potential output, stood at 78.5% in the fourth quarter of the most recent reporting period, only modestly down from the quarter before. That's a meaningful slowdown, but it's not the picture of an industrial base in total freefall, and the damage has not been evenly distributed across workers or sectors. Research published through the conversation examining labor market impacts of the tariffs found that while American duties on Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, and auto parts have genuinely reshaped the manufacturing sector, the pain has landed unevenly, hitting some regions, occupations, and worker demographics far harder than others, while other parts of the manufacturing ecosystem have shown more resilience. Services sectors, meanwhile, have partially offset the manufacturing losses at the national level. Over the same 12-month period that manufacturing shed nearly 52,000 jobs, services industries added roughly 86,000, led by a 92,000 job surge in healthcare. That doesn't undo the damage in Windsor's auto plants or Hamilton's steel mills. Those are specific communities absorbing specific concentrated pain that a national healthcare hiring boom does nothing to fix locally, but it does mean the country's aggregate economic story is more complicated than a single word like destroyed can capture. So why has Canada chosen to keep retaliating instead of simply capitulating to American demands, the way most other countries facing Trump-era tariffs eventually did? Part of the answer is political. Prime Minister Carney has staked significant domestic credibility on standing firm, arguing publicly that the Trump administration has weaponized economic integration itself, and that folding now would validate a strategy of using tariffs to extract concessions on sovereignty-adjacent issues, a clear reference to Trump's repeated needling about Canada becoming a U.S. state. But part of the answer is also structural and strategic. Ottawa has spent the past year and a half building a policy toolkit specifically designed to blunt the impact of American tariffs without simply surrendering to them. The Buy Canadian procurement policy redirects government purchasing power toward domestic manufacturers. Remission frameworks allow Canadian companies that rely on U.S. steel and aluminum inputs for things like automobile production, aerospace manufacturing, and food packaging to apply for relief from Canada's own retaliatory counter tariffs, so that Canadian manufacturers using American inputs aren't punished twice, once by U.S. tariffs on their exports and again by Canada's own counter tariffs on their imports. That's a sophisticated bit of policy engineering designed to protect Canadian industrial capacity even while the broader trade war rages. Carney's government has also leaned into diversification, announcing new investments, including a 6-ship icebreaker fleet, that signal a broader strategic pivot toward Arctic sovereignty, European partnerships, and reduce long-term dependency on the American market. None of that erases the immediate pain in the labor market, but it does suggest Ottawa is playing a longer game than simply waiting for Washington to relent. There's also a piece of this story that connects Canada's trade war to a much bigger, older piece of unfinished business: the fate of the USMCA itself, the very trade agreement that was supposed to lock in decades of frictionless commerce between the three North American economies. The White House has stated plainly that it did not agree to renew the USMCA in its current form, arguing the deal wasn't sufficiently beneficial to American interests. That's a striking admission, because it means the tariff war isn't just a temporary dispute to be resolved with a side deal. It's tied to a fundamental renegotiation of the legal architecture underpinning North American trade. If USMCA's current framework doesn't get renewed or gets replaced with something considerably more restrictive, the entire premise that Canadian manufacturers built their business models on for the past 3 decades, guaranteed low-friction access to the American market, simply stops being true. That's the deeper strategic stake behind the day-to-day tariff headlines. It's not just about the price of steel or the cost of a pickup truck. It's about whether the foundational trade relationship between two of the closest allies in the world gets rebuilt on entirely different terms. It's worth pausing here to compare this moment to the last time Washington used Section 232 tariffs against Canadian steel and aluminum, because the contrast tells you how much has changed. Back in 2018, during Trump's first term, the administration imposed 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum from Canada. Citing the same national security rationale, Canada retaliated then too, with dollar-for-dollar counter-tariffs on American goods, ranging from steel to whiskey to yogurt. That dispute lasted roughly a year before both sides reached a deal in 2019 that lifted the tariffs entirely, clearing the way for USMCA's ratification the following year. At the time, many analysts treated that episode as an aberration, a rough patch in an otherwise durable alliance resolved through negotiation once both governments decided the costs of continued escalation outweighed the benefits. The current fight looks structurally different, and that difference matters enormously for how this story is likely to end. The tariffs now in place aren't 25%, they're 50%, layered on top of tariffs that were already 50% from an earlier round of escalation. The legal basis has expanded beyond a single statute to include Section 232, Section 338, and previously Section IEEPA authorities before the Supreme Court struck those down. And unlike 2018, when the dispute stayed relatively contained to metals, this fight now spans autos, lumber, dairy, alcohol, pharmaceuticals, copper, timber, and furniture, touching nearly every major Canadian export category simultaneously. In other words, this isn't a narrower rerun of 2018. It's a broader, deeper, and more structurally embedded conflict. And that's exactly why economists like Trevor Tome are modeling job losses in the tens of thousands, rather than treating this as a temporary irritant that resolves itself within a single negotiating cycle. The lumber and softwood industry adds another layer to this picture, and it's a useful reminder that not every wound in Canadian manufacturing traces directly back to 2025. Canadian lumber production has actually been on a multi-year downward trend that predates the current tariff war entirely, rooted in long-running softwood lumber disputes between the two countries that stretch back decades, well before Trump's second term began. What changed in October 2025 was that Washington layered fresh tariffs on top of an already weakened sector. By February 2026, Canadian lumber exports to the United States were running roughly 20% below their 2024 averages. A serious blow, but one that has to be understood as compounding pre-existing structural weakness rather than representing a totally new shock created from nothing. That distinction matters if you're trying to accurately diagnose how much of Canada's current industrial pain is attributable to this specific trade war versus longer-running trends in specific sectors like softwood lumber, where trade friction with the U.S. has been a recurring feature of the relationship since the 1980s. Zoom out from Canada specifically, and this trade war carries consequences that extend well beyond North America. Global steel and aluminum markets don't operate in isolated national silos. They're deeply interconnected, and a 50% American tariff wall against one major supplier inevitably redirects global trade flows. When Canadian steel and aluminum get priced out of the U.S. market, that metal doesn't simply disappear. Producers look for other buyers, often in Europe or Asia, which can push down prices in those markets as displaced supply competes for a smaller pool of alternative customers. That's part of why Canadian aluminum producers, after losing roughly half their U.S. sales, pivoted toward European buyers, accepting lower margins in the process. It's also why global steel prices, already softened by years of oversupply out of major producers, have faced additional downward pressure as tariff walls reroute trade around the world's largest economy. For American manufacturers who rely on imported steel and aluminum as industrial inputs, everything from appliance makers to construction firms to defense contractors, the tariffs have functioned less like a clean win for domestic producers and more like a tax passed through the supply chain. a dynamic reflected in RBC's own analysis, showing that U.S. corporate profits have taken a hit this year, even as headline consumer prices haven't yet risen as sharply as some economists initially predicted. That's likely to change, according to RBC's own projections, with more significant consumer price effects expected to show up more clearly through 2026, as pre-tariff inventories continue to run down, and companies are forced to pass rising input costs onto buyers. There's also a geopolitical signal being sent here that reaches far beyond Ottawa and Washington. Every American trading partner, from the European Union to Japan to South Korea to Mexico, has been watching exactly how this dispute unfolds. Because Canada was, for decades, considered the single most trusted, most integrated, most reliable American trading partner on Earth. If a 50% tariff wall can go up against Canada, backed by century-old statutes most trade lawyers had forgotten existed, then no bilateral trade relationship, however deep its historical roots, can be treated as permanently insulated from this kind of pressure. That's precisely why the White House's own accounting singled out China and Canada as the only two trading partners that chose retaliation over negotiation. For Beijing, standing firm against American tariffs fits a broader strategic posture already years in the making. For Ottawa, it represents something more unusual. A close military and economic ally choosing confrontation over accommodation, a decision that itself signals just how existential Carney's government views the stakes of simply capitulating to Washington's demands. There's also a fascinating detail buried in the trade talks that hints at where this could eventually head, even amid all the hostility. Reports that a prospective deal being discussed included a renewed push to build the Keystone XL pipeline, a project that had been canceled back in 2021 after years of environmental controversy. If that idea resurfaces as part of an eventual settlement, it would suggest that even amid an escalating tariff war, both governments are quietly exploring large-scale, politically significant infrastructure and energy cooperation as a bargaining chip. A reminder that trade wars, however heated the public rhetoric gets, often still contain back-channel negotiations pursuing off-ramps that rarely make headlines until a deal is actually announced. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office, responding to one round of tariff news, described a still unfinished deal framework as including comprehensive market access for all American goods, economic security commitments, digital trade alignment, and other provisions meant to protect the American market while, in the USTR's own characterization, still working along with our Canadian partners. Whether that framing survives the political theater on both sides remains to be seen. Before we get to where this leaves Canada's manufacturing base, it's worth walking through the handful of scenarios that are actually plausible from here, because the range of outcomes is wider than most coverage suggests. In the most optimistic scenario, negotiators reach a comprehensive USMCA adjacent deal before the January 2027 deadline, addressing the dairy quota disputes, softening the scheduled auto and parts tariff hike, and restoring some of the remission frameworks that have kept Canadian manufacturers afloat. That outcome would still leave Canada's industrial base smaller and more diversified than it was in 2024, but it would stop the bleeding and let the sector stabilize around a new, lower baseline. In a middle scenario, talks continue in fits and starts. Some sector-specific carve-outs get negotiated, auto parts say, or aerospace-linked steel, while the broader 50% tariff structure remains largely intact, producing a slow, grinding continuation of the job losses seen over the past year rather than a sudden collapse or clean resolution. In the most severe scenario, talks break down entirely. The January auto and parts tariffs take full effect without modification, and Ontario's auto sector, already showing signs of strain in its production and employment numbers, absorbs a shock on top of an already weakened labor market, potentially pushing the total tariff-linked job losses meaningfully past the 90,000 mark that economists like Tome have already modeled as a plausible ceiling under current conditions. Which of these paths actually unfolds will depend on factors well outside pure economics: domestic political pressure on both leaders, the state of the broader U.S.-China relationship, energy markets, and how much political capital Carney is willing to keep spending on a confrontational posture that, so far, has not produced the kind of quick capitulation from Washington that ended the 2018 and 2019 dispute in under a year. Where does this actually leave Canada's manufacturing base heading into 2027? The honest answer, stripped of the dramatic framing that headlines like this one often carry, is this: Canada's manufacturing sector has been genuinely and measurably damaged by more than a year of escalating American tariffs, with over 50,000 direct manufacturing jobs lost, concentrated heavily in Ontario's steel and auto corridors, and independent economic modeling suggesting the total employment impact, once indirect and supply chain effects are included, could reach as high as 90,000 jobs. Steel exports have fallen by roughly half. Auto production has softened, with a harder blow still to come once 50% tariffs on vehicles, and, for the first time, auto parts, take full effect at the start of 2027. But destroyed implies something total, final, and irreversible, and the actual data tells a more layered story. Aluminum producers found partial relief by redirecting exports to Europe and eventually clawing back much of their lost American sales once U.S. inventories ran dry. Industrial capacity utilization, while down, remains above 3/4 of total potential. Services sector job growth has partially, though not fully, cushioned the national employment picture. And Ottawa has built a real policy infrastructure. Remission frameworks, buy Canadian procurement, counter tariffs, and diversification investments specifically engineered to keep as much of the country's industrial base alive as possible, while the political fight over USMCA's future plays out. What hasn't been resolved, and what will determine whether this becomes a defining moment of structural decline or simply a painful, survivable chapter in North American trade history, is what happens over the next several months. The January 2027 auto tariff hike is now locked in, according to the President's own public statements, and it lands directly on Ontario's most important industrial sector at a moment when many of its labor and supply contracts are already up for renegotiation. If Ottawa and Washington can find a genuine deal before then, one that addresses the underlying disputes over dairy quotas, automotive market access, and the broader shape of a renewed USMCA, the worst of the threatened escalation could still be avoided. If they can't, Canada's auto sector, already showing signs of strain, faces its most serious test yet. Precisely at the moment, its workforce has the least room left to absorb further shocks. Either way, one thing has already changed permanently, regardless of how the negotiations end. For 3 decades, Canadian manufacturers built their strategies around the assumption that access to the American market was a fixed, dependable constant, as reliable as geography itself. That assumption is gone now, and it isn't coming back, no matter what deal eventually gets signed. Every major manufacturing decision made in Canada from this point forward, where to build a new plant, how much to invest in aging equipment, whether to expand or relocate, will now be made with the explicit understanding that the American market can be turned into a weapon overnight, by proclamation, without warning and without appeal. That is the lasting legacy of this trade war, far more than any single tariff number or any single quarter's job losses. It's a fundamental, probably permanent shift in how one of the world's most integrated economic relationships gets managed, negotiated, and trusted going forward. And every ally watching from the outside, in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America, is taking careful notes on exactly how quickly economic partnership can turn into economic leverage, and exactly how much a supposedly ironclad alliance is actually worth when a trade deficit becomes a political grievance.